Now for my top tip to help you find the best Mk1 TTs in the classifieds. Hello and welcome back to the Volkswizard channel, and welcome to episode 2 of the How to Buy a Good Mk1 Audi TT series of videos. In episode 1 we looked at which models had been imported into the UK, and in today's video we're going to delve into the often murky used car market and decide which of the many models is the one to buy today. And stay tuned, because at the end of the video I'm going to share with you my top tip for buying a good one, and the best bit is it's completely free and it can be done from the comfort of your home. But before we get started, let me remind you guys how you can support the channel. The easiest way as ever is to subscribe. Big thanks to everybody who has already subscribed, but we're still getting lots of views from non-subscribers. So if you're one of those and you like what you see, then I'm sure you know what to do by now. Okay, before we start scouring the classifieds, you need to decide why you want to buy a Mk1 TT, because this will obviously affect the one that's best for you to buy. For example, if you're looking for a daily driver, then I'd recommend going for as late and as simple one as possible, and that would be a 190 front-wheel drive coupe. They're simpler because they're not four-wheel drive, they don't have quattro, they're better on fuel as well, and they're quite nice to drive. If you're looking for a car to keep in the garage and have as weekend fun, and you don't want to do an awful lot of tinkering, then a low mileage, properly historied, I think 225 coupe or roadster would be the one I'd go for, or a 3.2, because that 6-cylinder engine is really powerful and sounds fantastic, and it's also quite reliable, but not completely reliable. We'll talk about that later. Coupe or roadster, whatever you prefer. If you're looking for a project where some of the pleasure of owning it comes from working on it, then there are plenty of cheap 1.8 Ts out there. There's quite a lot going on under the bonnet of a 1.8 T with the turbo and like diverter valves, vacuum hoses and vacuum valves and stuff like that. So it's easy to buy one that's not perfect and put it right, but just make sure it's solid, because it's much easier to put the mechanicals right than it is the bodywork, and there will be some rusty cars out there. If you're looking for a longer term investment, then you could buy a low mileage Quattro Sport, but the problem is people are already asking a lot of money for those cars, and will they go up much more? I'm not so sure. Much better value is something like a 3.2 manual, which is about half the price of the Quattro Sport, mileage being the same. Or you could buy a mint early 17-inch wheel car, which is the first batch of cars until they put the 18-inch wheels on them. Or a good investment, I think, would be an 18-inch wheel, so sort of 02 to end of run, a 225 coupe. I think coupes offer the best investment potential, as the TT is all about the looks and they look a lot better than the roadster in my opinion. But if you want a cheap, fun convertible, then a Mk1 TT is brilliant. They've got a decent boot, they've got an integrated wind deflector, the roof is relatively simple, so even if it goes wrong it won't be too tragic to have that fixed, and I would say they're much better in a crash than, for example, a Mk1 Golf convertible, which would probably be even more expensive than the TT. Okay, so where should you look to buy a Mk1 Audi TT? Well, the top two websites are Auto Trader and eBay. There is some overlap, but I think generally you'll find the better cars on Auto Trader. I'd recommend you set up a search on both of those sites so that you get alerts when the car you want goes on sale. And that's important, because whilst there are lots for sale, there aren't that many in good condition, and I think anything that's good will sell really quickly, so you need to be ahead of the game. If you see a car for sale on Auto Trader that's got this background, it means that the car has been sold through British car auctions, and you need to be doubly careful, because that dealer will have bid online for that car and he won't have driven it. Now currently on Auto Trader there are around 200 Mk1 TTs. That sounds like quite a lot, but when you start looking, you will discount the majority of them for various reasons. It could be a combination or all of these, double figure owners, really high mileage, modifications, no service history, or the car just looks rubbish in the photos. Don't buy a Mk1 TT in a rush, because it's quite possible the car you want may not be within that 200. Take your time and just see what comes on the market would be a good tip. What is interesting is that even though I'd have thought Audi sold a lot of the early cars because the buzz for this car when it came out was incredible, only 10% of those on sale are the early cars. Now, I call the early cars the cars that have no bigger than 17-inch wheels, because from around 2002 the standard wheel was 18 until we got some of the lower spec derivatives. And I think that's because a lot of them have already been scrapped. So yeah, beware, because there will be cars for sale that would be best off being scrapped rather than you buying. Of those for sale, they're roughly 2/3 coupe and 1/3 convertible. Just under 1/3 are 3.2s. That came out in 2003, ran to the end of the run. And there are just 6 manual 3.2 coupes on the market, the majority of which you will discount for the owners or the mileage or various other things that aren't particularly appealing. Compare that with 11 Quattro Sport. So whilst the Quattro Sport was a relatively limited car, actually on the market today there are far fewer 3.2 manual coupes, which would make them quite a sound investment, I think, as long as you buy a good one. There's quite a few X write-offs as well, Cat D, etc. It's just not worth buying those really, because you can buy a good straight car for not much more. What does £1,000 or below buy you today? Well, it generally buys you cars with issues. There aren't actually many of these cars for sale, because I reckon if you're a TT breaker, anything below £1,000 is worth much more in spare. So there are a couple of project cars on there at the moment. Please spend more if you've got it, or buy something else if you haven't. £1,000 to £2,000, things look a lot better. There are lots of 1.8 T 150 Roadsters and lots of 180s and 225s with 18-inch wheels. So they're the later cars, but they've done over 150,000 miles, so there's no investment potential in those. There's also some mega mile 3.2s as well. It's going to be a hard car to sell, so you're best off paying a bit more than that. 2,000 to 3,000, well, you start to get cars with less than 100,000 miles, including some of the 18-inch wheel cars, so from 2002 onwards. There are some nice early 225s as well, and late 190 coupes without Quattro and just 16-inch wheels. They don't look great, but put a set of wheels on them and you've got a nice car there, and they're relatively simple. 3.2 DSGs are also below £3,000, but you're looking at 100,000 miles. A much better bet would be a low mileage and low owner 150 Roadster, which isn't as exciting, but you'll get a much better car for your money. 3,000 to 4,000, this is where dealer cars generally start to appear, but not all dealers are the same. So just check the reviews very carefully. You can get 180 Quattro coupes with under 100,000 miles and not too many owners. 3.2 DSG coupes with over 100,000 miles. They might even have a new timing chain, but I think a lower mileage one that hasn't had a timing chain will be easier to sell. 4K to 5K. Well, now you start to get 3.2 DSG coupes and Roadsters with well under 100,000 miles, but they might have had a few owners. You get the 18-inch wheels, so the later 225 Roadsters with well under 100,000 miles too. And there are some 3.2 coupe manuals around the 100,000 mile mark there. 5,000 to 6,000, you now start to get really good cars, or at least that's how they appear in the adverts. So low owner, tidy 18-inch wheel cars, so the later 180s and 225s. They've got the titanium headlights and they've got the lattice grills. That was the fully updated car. 225 coupes and Roadsters can be had in this price point. There's a 60,000 mile 3.2 DSG Roadster as well. So a nice car, pretty good investment. You just want to hope you don't get caught with the timing chains and the mechatronics on the gearbox. We'll talk about that later. Over £6,000, there is, quite frankly, a lot of overpriced tap, but there is the odd gem as well. So you might find like a sub 40,000 mile 180 Quattro Roadster with not too many owners, or a slightly higher mileage 225 Roadster. Between £7,000 and £8,000, we start to see the Quattro Sports with around 100,000 miles on the clock. A far better buy would be a 50,000 mile 3.2 DSG Roadster or coupe, or with a slightly higher mileage, you'll start to get a 3.2 manual roadster as well, and that's a really rare car. Beyond that, mainly it's quattro sports and the odd sub 30,000 mile 3.2 and 225. In the next episode, I'll be sharing with you a buying guide for when you go and see the car, but to help you narrow down the choice, here are some things to consider. Okay, these are just a number of points I've made. They're in no particular order, but when you start looking at the classifiers, you might be bewildered by how many are for sale. This should help you narrow it down to a shortlist that are worth going to see. So, additional costs you need to bear in mind are cam belts, which on the 1.8 T engines, so the 180 or the 150, the 180, the 190, the 225, Quattro Sport 240, they're due every 5 years officially, though that might have been deleted now by Audi. So it's up to you, but they do fail if they're not changed, so I'd still stick to the 5-year rule and a maximum of 60,000 miles. The other thing to look out for are timing chains on the 3.2. I would say these roughly last around 100,000 miles. So if you're looking at one that's done 100k and it hasn't had timing chains, then it's best to budget for that, and that's going to be at least £2,000. Also, try and zoom into the pictures and just see if the car has all the same make of tyres. Ideally, you want a premium brand, but the good news is they're actually relatively cheap to replace. Budget tyres are not the end of the world, but they do suggest a cost-cutting approach to maintenance. Again, zoom into the pictures and have a look at the centre display of the instrument cluster. Are there any pixels missing? You can probably live with this, but instrument cluster faults were a big problem back in the day. It actually made it onto the BBC consumer programme Watchdog, and Audi UK intervened and were replacing them free of charge, even for cars with no Audi history and ones that were out of warranty. Some cars will have limped on with incorrect reading fuel gauge, so just check that the range displayed in the trip computer relates to the range shown by the fuel gauge, because I'm sure a lot of people have had misreading optimistic fuel gauges and run out of petrol on the way home, having just bought the car. Original wheels are pretty much essential. Beware, there are lots of replicas out there, particularly of the 18-inch RS4 style wheel. You want them in the original colour. The most expensive TT Mark 1 right now is about 15k, and it looks like a nice car. It's a roadster manual with low mileage, but it's got nearly black wheels. Another tip is look very carefully at the stance of the car, because these cars suffered from broken springs and some people will have fitted the wrong ones. Spec-wise, I wouldn't worry too much about it. It's no big deal if you've got Bose or cruise control. It doesn't really add any value to the car. Although if you really want cruise control, beware it, because it can be quite expensive to retrofit, but it's still better to retrofit than to buy a bad car with cruise. Condition is far more important than spec. And yes, there are some lovely colours out there. I mean, I can't believe Goodwood Green was a standard colour. There are a couple for sale, but they're a bit expensive for the mileage and history. So honestly, do not choose based on colour. You need to choose on condition, and there is no bad colour anyway. A word of warning, below £2,000 from what I've seen on Auto Trader, it's a very dangerous price point. So avoid it or take somebody with you who knows what they're doing, but just be aware that a lot of the journeys to view will be wasted journeys. Do you really want to project, even though there are some cheap cars out there? Because good cars aren't that much more. Labour rates since lockdown and even before, and bodywork has always been expensive, and I think this is definitely a case of buy the best car you can afford. If you've only got £2,000 to £3,000 to spend, then I'd recommend a 150 Roadster. They are the newest of TTs. They started in 03, they ran pretty much to the end. There's no all-wheel drives to worry about, and some of them have got heated leather, which makes a big difference to how they feel, and some of them have even got some really nice 17-inch wheels. The polished 5-spoke competition wheels actually made a comeback, but I don't think they're a particularly good investment in the longer term. 150 and 180 and 190 horsepower TTs, basically the cars with a single tailpipe, are plentiful, but a 225 or even a 3.2 isn't that much more, and I think they're a lot more desirable. There are plenty of 3.2 DSGs out there, but the risks of that going wrong and the pleasure of driving a manual make, I think, that quite hard to justify. The manuals are rare, but if that's what you want, then I wouldn't compromise. I'm having to tell myself that because there are some really good DSG cars out there, but I keep on thinking how nice it will be to select second to third with that V6, and yeah, I'm going to wait. I think the motoring media is responsible for the mechanically identical Mk4 Golf R32 being so coveted and shooting up in value in recent years, while they've kind of overlooked the TT 3.2, which for the general public, not motoring journalists, I think is a much more covetable car. To have that in your garage as a sleek coupe that still looks good today with a 6-cylinder engine and a manual gearbox, it's far more exciting than having just another Golf. I know the R32 is brilliant, but for a weekend car, the TT 3.2 just seems so much more exciting to have. Mileage-wise, there are cars over 200,000 miles, no surprise because they've been around for 20 years, but as ever, the lower the better. Well, that's not always the case. There are some really nice high mileage cars, and there are probably some real low mileage dogs, but yeah, you can invest in a low mileage car and it will be really desirable. If you buy a high mileage car and you have to put money into it, it'll never be desirable. For example, you could have a 3.2 with 150,000 miles and timing chains for £2,000, but it's never going to be easy to sell on, and with that kind of mileage, particularly if it's black or blue, it's going to be quite tatty. Another thing to be aware of is dealers selling cars in the £2,000 to £5,000 range. They will have probably bought from auctions. That means they won't have test driven the cars and they'll have no idea what it'll be like on the road. And if there are problems, they probably won't have any budget to fix them. So I'd recommend you either buy from private sellers who live in the right part of town and have had the car for at least a couple of years, or buy from dealers that usually sell more expensive cars and they might have had this in Part X and it was too good for them to trade on. Now let's talk about number of owners, because the TT is mainly over 20 years old and it's always been the kind of car that people have had for a bit and then moved on. There are some cars out there with double figure owners, and how that affects you when it comes to the desirability of that car depends on how you feel about number of owners. There is no direct link between number of owners and condition of the car, so an 11 owner car might be way better than a 5 owner car. There's a school of thought that says that every time a car changes hands, it receives a new love. But the main reason cars with lots of owners is bad is because there's always a feeling there's something wrong with the car, and that's why it's been moved on so frequently. And I think that's particularly an issue with cars like the Mk1 TT, where the cost of putting most of them right is more than the car's worth. And it's especially the case with something like the TT 3.2, where you can check the gearbox if it works okay, you can check the hood works okay, but it's really hard for you to tell if the timing chains are worn, and if you do have them checked and you find they're out of spec, there's a high risk they're going to fail and scrap the engine. Quite often when owners find that out, they move the car on to the unwary, so be very, very careful. Now, let's talk about Japanese imports. We're seeing more and more cars imported to the UK from Japan. Often the adverts say the car can't be rusty because it's lived in Japan. Well, Japan actually does get quite a bit of snow, but maybe not in Tokyo. So it all depends where the car's lived. Also, they have really bad traffic, so they prefer automatics. And as a result, even low mileage cars can have gearboxes that are quite worn out. The main problem for me though with Jap imports is that you cannot test drive the car. So if the gearbox is jerky, I don't think that would come on any appraisal. You'll get it back into the UK and yeah, you can't complain because they're thousands of miles away. They don't even speak the same language. The other problem with Jap imports as well is that if they have criminals in Japan, and because the Japanese cars are sold to people in England and all around the world, those people really have no redress when the car lands and there's a problem with it, whether it's been clocked or it's faulty, or it could even be stolen. Now for my top tip to help you find the best Mk1 TTs in the classifieds from the comfort of your sofa, and that is to make sure you look at the MOT history database. So for those out of the UK, the MOT is an annual check for cars over 3 years old to make sure they're roadworthy. In 2006, this test was digitised, and as a result, test results from 2006 are accessible to anybody. All you need to know is the registration number of the car, and it's completely free of charge. This will give you a decent feel for the condition of the car and how it's been maintained. Take a good note of any mention of corrosion. If it's the springs, then I wouldn't worry too much, but if you see the word subframe or mounting points, then this can mean the car's pretty crusty underneath. I wouldn't necessarily write the car off, but you need to have a good look underneath it, because generally the bit you can see is usually the tip of the iceberg. Also, on the MOT history, you can see if the owner has dealt with items that have been advised by the tester. So they might say that your shocks are leaking, but they're not too bad, or there's corrosion here and there, or CV boots, not great condition. If the owner's had that dealt with and it doesn't recur in later tests, then that's a really good sign. And you can also see if the mileage is accurate. There's no 100% guarantee to make sure that the mileage is genuine, but it gives you a good idea of the car's mileage in its later life. For the first 3 years, there's no MOT history. That reminds me, you should always make sure cars have got a full service history. I'll tell you a little story about MOT history that really helped me out. There's a really nice TT 3.2 on Auto Trader. It's done 30-something thousand miles, same owner since 2008. I was hoping its MOT history would be spectacularly good, but unfortunately there was nothing before 2018. And it turns out the owner who had it in 2008 still owns it, took it abroad for 10 years and brought it back. And as a result, there's no MOT history for that period. And because it's such a low mileage car, I get the feeling there's not an awful lot of history as well. So when you come to sell it, you won't really be able to ask the high price that a car in this condition would normally be able to justify if it had a full service history. Now in the next video, I'm going to show you what you need to do when you go and view a TT. Rather than just give you a list of things to look at sitting here, I'm actually going to recreate the process that I follow when I go and see a car on somebody's driveway. Audi UK have very kindly donated their immaculate TT Quattro Sport from their heritage fleet, so I can walk you around the car, and in due course there'll be a full review of that car as well. Maybe it is worth paying the extra for a Quattro Sport. We'll certainly find out once I get my hands on that car. As ever guys, thanks for watching this Volks with the video. Keep subscribing, keep commenting, and I'll see you for the next one very soon.